Well, good afternoon. I am not Christopher Oak. He had a work conflict, so as Joyce noted, I was happy to pitch in, so away we go. Most of you know the community we call home stemmed from the arrival of the United States Army in early December of 1867. No home or business, no welcoming committee or USO greeted the cold and tired members of the 4th United States Cavalry who set up tents here. Within 10 years, they erected 9 officers' quarters, 6 barracks, a hospital, headquarters, supply and support structures, and eventually claimed a 1,600-acre reservation. When anyone thinks of a fort, they imagine soldiers, cannons, horses, mules, wagons, but few ever mention either chaplains or religion, and that is what we will cover today. Immediately, one ponders a thematic conflict between a profession of kindness, morality, and saintly behavior, and another line of work where success is measured in breaking things and killing people. Still, chaplains and their ancestors are as old as the concept of armies and military conflict, millennia before us, going back to the medieval times and the Crusades, and further to the ancient Romans, Phoenicians, Egyptians, and any other expanding empire. But for many of those ancient armies, the chaplain was not concerned with the morals of the men and their morale. The chaplain, or whatever he was called, attended to the signs and other criteria that predicted good days and conditions to fight and defeat one's enemies. Whole armies turned on what guidance the chaplain could ascertain from natural phenomena and other symbols only he could understand as the intermediary between the troops and some higher authority. By the 1700s, the purpose of chaplains and their formal affiliations to recognize religion brought the system to something we now recognize, a professional cleric whose primary function was serving the religious needs of the soldiers. When Fort Concho was established in 1867, the chaplains were appointed by the President upon endorsement of the General-in-Chief of the Army. And for most of Fort Concho's active years, that would be the crusty and oftentimes blunt William Tecumseh Sherman from 1869 to 1883. Sherman summarized his view as reflected by congressional and military policy in 1882 in this letter to a brother of a potential applicant. This is Sherman writing. My dear sir, yours of July 24 is received, and if your brother will make his application to the Secretary of War for a chaplaincy in the Army and send me his papers, I will endorse and lay them before the Secretary for the action of the President, who alone makes such appointments. I never give original letters to the President or Secretary of War because it would be wrong for me to do so, as they might refer several applications to me for selection, and I would seem to be committed to the one holding my letter. I think there are several hundred applicants now, each one of whom is stronger in the faith than St. Paul, and most of whom before appointment are anxious to be martyrs. But once appointed and confirmed, they object to our frontier posts because they are ill-adapted for raising a large family of small children. Of course, the whole system is now a farce and meant to be so. If Congress wanted the Army to have the influence of religion, it would allow the commanding officer of each post remote from civilization to hire and pay for a minister while employed like a surgeon. Of such posts, there are nearly 100, whereas the chaplains are limited to 30, and say half of whom are sick or don't like the isolation of Texas and Arizona. Of course, there are no vacancies now, and they are gobbled up as soon as the telegraph announces a death. And there are no resignations. and so greedy are the applicants that they will not even wait for the funeral. If your brother wants to join this scramble to become a martyr, let him send me his papers, and I will see they are filed, and then let him have some senator or member of Congress to rush to the president the moment he learns a chaplain is in extremis. Very truly yours, W.T. Sherman, General. Sherman was not being politically correct, but he was right on the mark for its day. The soldiers and their officers did not place a high priority on religion, especially on the western frontier, where a post chaplain might be the only religious professional for several thousand square miles. Chaplains were authorized by an 1838 act of Congress that they be, quote, assigned to places most destitute of instruction, close quote. By the Army Appropriations Bill of 1870, they were given the equivalent rank of a cavalry lieutenant with an annual salary of $1,500. Congress authorized only 30 chaplains who had to cover the whole nation and its several hundred forts and other facilities. Given those numbers, most posts rarely had chaplains, and as one Catholic soldier wrote from a frontier post in Colorado, quote, "We are living here like hermits, but not doing penance for our sins, as there are no churches or clergy within 600 miles of us. So when a man dies or gets married, it is the adjutant that reads the ceremonies, which is very un-Catholic." A special provision was made for the African-American Buffalo Soldier units of the 9th and 10th Cavalry and 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments, with a chaplain assigned to the regiment itself. But that system became less effective when a regiment's 10 to 12 companies or troops were scattered across a wide territory at different posts, like the 10th Cavalry was in Texas in the 1870s and 1880s. As one cavalry sergeant said, there are no Sundays in the Army, and services were usually sparsely attended except for holidays and funerals. At posts where no chaplain was assigned, there might not be a service for months. And if it were an isolated place where a civilian preacher might be, he would take over. Soldiers taking their religious activity into their own hands faced challenges from their bunkmates, as a 4th Cavalry trooper pointed out. This is the soldier now talking about one of his bunkies, one of his fellow soldiers. "The first night he was among us, he got down on his knees beside his cot and prayed. Heads were raised in surprise at this innovation, and all over the quarters, shoes, boots, bootjacks, canteens, clothing, and other missiles were thrown at him until he was about covered. The believer nonetheless persisted in his ritual every night, and during the next 10 days steadily won the respect of his comrades for his endurance, if not his faith. Then no one in the room of about 50 men would have dared to have thrown anything at him. Any missile thrower would have been handled roughly." While the officers were less dramatic in their objections, they did set the tone that contributed to most chaplains being ignored at worst and tolerated at best. Fort Concho's longest-serving commander, Colonel Benjamin Grierson, made these comments to his wife Alice in a letter regarding the appointment of the newest post chaplain to his command in 1876. "I am sorry that this Chaplain Dunbar has not a loud call to go somewhere else. But the powers that be have ordered him here, possibly because this is a chaplain's post, or maybe on account of the supreme wickedness of this locality. He will be good to occupy quarters and eat commissary stores and to attend strictly to everybody's business but his own. I hope he will succeed in saving a great many souls, his own included." But Grierson changed his evaluation of Chaplain Dunbar in a letter later written to his wife after he heard his first service. Again, Colonel Grierson. The chaplain preached quite a good sermon. He has an easy delivery and set forth some plain, sensible, conservative, democratic, religious ideas in an effective and agreeable manner. He is to preach tonight again, especially for the soldiers and the colored people. There was a good many soldiers present today. He, the chaplain, takes hold of matters as if he was determined to put forth his very best endeavor and to make himself useful in every possible way. And I am rather inclined to think that he will be successful. Ironically, chaplains had many duties, and at some posts, the core religious ones consumed the least amount of their time. Chaplains were in charge of another activity that soldiers usually ignored: education. The Army put the chaplain in charge of any efforts to educate the enlisted men and the children of the soldiers and the officers, but the High Command did not encourage such instruction initially, nor did they make it mandatory until the late 1800s. While a substantial percentage of the white troops were illiterate, this challenge was a distinct problem in the black units, whose members' previous history in slavery and other menial tasks precluded any educational instruction. For all 4 black regiments, the Army had an ongoing challenge to find and nurture soldiers who could perform the huge level of daily, monthly, and annual reports and record keeping the military required. Sometimes, a post chaplain would find a soldier with such instructional talents, and the Army did authorize extra pay for his efforts in teaching his fellow troopers. The post chaplain also supervised the post bakery to ensure the daily bread was efficiently baked and pleasing to the men. There was a high level of record keeping involved in this task, so who better to entrust the paperwork and the money and the flour and the supplies on the inside and the loaves of bread on the outbound side than your chaplain? Other duties often assigned to the chaplain would be post treasurer, handling discretionary post funds, post librarian, and supervisor of the post garden. Such other duties as assigned were common in the post-Civil War military, where junior officers were especially tasked with extra duties involving discipline, surveys of equipment, guard mount, recruiting, courts-martial, and building and construction. Fort Concho's record with chaplains and religion was somewhat mixed in its 22 years of active service between 1867 and 1889. In all, 6 men of the cloth were assigned. The first, Thaddeus Banks McFalls of Pennsylvania, came in late 1868, had recurring fever from a previous illness, soon left, received a medical discharge, and died in 1873. Manuel Joaquim Gonzalez, born on the Portuguese island of Madeira, was next, and he was assigned to the 9th Cavalry Buffalo Soldier Regiment. And he wasn't at Fort Concho much. He was on sick leave for 2/3 of his Army career after the Civil War, and eventually passed away in 1880. Norman Badger arrived in 1871. A native of Massachusetts, he worked very hard in his tenure with an establishment of the post school, supervising the bakery, library, and garden, and preaching in other posts in the region. He held services in any space he could find at Fort Concho, including tents, mess halls, and the post trader's bar room. Perhaps he worked a little too hard, as he fell ill in the spring of 1876 and eventually died at Fort Concho on June 5, 1876. Elijah Guillen, a native of New York, veteran of the Civil War and chaplaincy service, was assigned to Fort Concho after Badger's death, but his declining health prevented his travel from Indian Territory, Oklahoma, and he eventually died in January of 1879. George Dunbar from Janesville, Wisconsin, came to Fort Concho in October of 1876. He assumed all the special duties held by his predecessors, including postmaster. Under his tenure, the current chapel was built, the last structure erected at the fort in 1879, and still used today for programs and events. Shortly after the building opened, Dunbar fainted and could not continue his duties. He received a medical leave in 1880 and eventually had further duty in more temperate climates in the Dakota Territories and California, retired in 1897 and died in 1911. The last chaplain, Francis Heyer Weaver from Pennsylvania, was at the fort assigned to the 10th Cavalry in July of 1880, and he remained here until 1882, when the entire regiment moved to Fort Davis. He followed his regiment to Arizona and Montana, where the severe winter caused his health issues and a retirement in 1897. There are no records of any chaplains assigned to Fort Concho after Weaver left. The town across the river that grew into San Angelo, so named by 1883, had several churches and ministers. It is probable the Army saw no need of assigning anyone. By the mid-1880s, it was clear Fort Concho was not critical to any frontier mission, as the frontier had passed it by. With the railroad arriving in September of 1888, the post's active days were numbered, and the Army closed the post in June the next year. Chaplains and the work they did represent a vital part of our community's origins. Most folks don't realize that San Angelo's first efforts in education, music, theater, sports, reading, libraries, literature, plus many more cultural aspects started with the U.S. Army here 157 years ago. The military is not credited with its economic, social, and cultural benefits in any community. Armies truly represent more than breaking things and killing people. The post chaplains at Fort Concho are a part of that story, and they deserve to be remembered. Thank you. I think there's time for a question or two, if anyone may have one. If not, I will turn it over back to Joyce. Yes, in the front row. Why am I not surprised?
You know, I know in the Civil War, the symbol for the chaplain, the insignia of the chaplain was the Latin cross. I know at one point they went back to using the original symbol, which was the shepherd's crook.
Correct.
And then in 1918, they went back to the cross, and by that time they had Jewish chaplains, they went to the Star of David and the tablets. What was the symbol, the insignia of the chaplains at Fort Concho?
It would have been the shepherd's crook. Yeah. And you see that on what they call the shoulder boards. And by the way, just because of the nature of the age, they're all good Protestants. There weren't too many Catholic chaplains in the Army in those days, even though most of the Irish were Catholic. Anyone else? Then we thank you and we turn you back to our host.